Welcome along to DigiShift 74, Big Tech Business Models, Human Rights and Ethics. So today we're going to be exploring all the ethical discussions that are thrown up for the third sector in terms of big tech's approach to human rights. Since post-pandemic, we've probably kind of raced into an era where we're embracing these technologies much more so than ever before. But are we asking the right questions? And today I'm particularly interested in what does this mean for the kind of sector leads, umbrella organisations, membership bodies, funders, and how are really they grappling with this topic? And for those of you in the room working in charities, what's your role and responsibility to think about this, both at a leadership level, but also at a board level as well? And we've got two really good speakers with us today. So we've got Tanya O'Carroll, who's an independent expert on technology and human rights. Tanya formerly co-founded and led Amnesty Tech, and more recently co-led People versus Big Tech, which is a coordinated effort of more than 100 civil society organisations to campaign and secure the strongest possible Digital Services Act. So lots of you have probably heard about that campaign before. I'm sure Tanya will cover a wee bit about that today. We're also really privileged today to have Ganna Pogrebna, who's the lead for Behavioural Data Science at the Alan Turing Institute. Ganna's work has blended behavioural science, AI, computer science, data analytics, engineering, and business model innovation. I would urge you to go and search some of the published papers that Ganna's published. Some really interesting reading within there. And Ganna's work for me has really helped not just the charity sector, but business, quite big businesses and cities, think about how they make more ethical decisions around technology and what that means for us as society. So really excited for this one today. As always, it will be recorded and will be available on YouTube afterwards as well. So we're going to hand over to Ganna first of all, and then we're here for Tanya, and then we've got a chance for a discussion and lots of questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ross. It's great to be here, so great to see so many people here interested in this topic. So I just want to have a little bit of a warning. I will mention suicide in my in my bit. So just if you find that distressing, just be mindful of that. It's kind of a quick thing. Yeah, so basically, yeah, I mean, I've already been introduced, but basically what I do is kind of something between behavior and computer science. And I just want to say I'm not a lawyer, so here Tanya is really the domain expert. I'm just kind of approaching it from the practicality of it. And normally I work with a lot of organizations. And on top of leading a strand and at the Alan Turing Institute, I also lead a regional institute in Australia where we work with a lot of underrepresented communities, specifically First Nations communities, to help them be better represented and included into our discourse about AI. Yeah, just kind of to start with, I just want to say that a lot of people are worried about Industrial Revolution 4.0, and we kind of constantly are discussing risks. But I just want to say that as humanity, we lived through at least 3 other industrial revolutions, and it's okay. We will live through this one. There will be changes. There will be differences. So some jobs probably will not exist in the future, but we just kind of will need to kind of tag along with it. Yeah, I just have a few motivating examples, and I mainly will talk about legal and ethical aspects today, and kind of will touch on human rights, which I'm sure Tanya will explore kind of more. So this is a case which I'm sure many of you have heard of when we had Uber self-driving car hitting a pedestrian in 2018. And this case is very interesting because it has a lot of implications, not only for ethics, not only for human rights, but also, you know, it's basically a problem that needs to be addressed from multiple different sides. And this is why, like, I really like this example because it needs collaboration from multiple disciplines, from multiple facets of industry to actually address the problem. So it's not only ethical and legal problem, it's also behavioral problem, it's an economic problem. And you know, there are obviously more philosophical issues here around, you know, should we have autonomous vehicles on the roads and things like that. We also have systems which have been used in, for example, this is an example from United States, where we had a system predicting reoffending, and this system has been proven to be incredibly racist. So as you know, if you're Black, you're more likely to be in jail, and therefore the training sets for this particular algorithm are such that they significantly disadvantage Black African American people. And here you see an example where, for example, the white person has a lot stronger priors, a lot more severe priors than the Black person, and yet the probability of reoffending for white person is predicted to be much lower than the probability of reoffending for Black person. And if you had to venture a guess whether the system is still used by American courts, it still is, even though there is a kind of note that you need to be mindful of what's going on. You know, with the proliferation of generative AI, we have even more significant risks at the moment that we need to consider. You probably heard about a person who committed suicide after talking to a chatbot recently, simply because the chatbot suggested that that's the best option for you to be more environmentally friendly. And we also had a lot of issues with systems like the usual chatbots like Siri or Alexa, where essentially there were privacy risks that were not sufficiently addressed. Yeah, so and when we're looking at this regulatory landscape, we have basically 4 different aspects. We have issues of regulatory concern. We have regulation that exists at the EU level and is very much applicable to our UK landscape. We also have several AI self-regulatory initiatives, and I will briefly touch on those. And then we also have kind of the global agenda. In terms of sort of high-level look at risks, I quite like this rather dated but really nice summary by AI for People initiative, where they identified 5 main challenges: reducing human control, removing human responsibility, devaluing human skills, eroding human self-determination, and enabling human wrongdoing. I'm not going to dwell on this. I will just kind of circulate the article later. I think it's very nice summary of the main risks, but we have worked with my colleagues for quite a while and identified for the Council of Europe a whole range of risks that are associated with AI systems and suggested ways to regulate them. The main problem we are facing is that there is a lot of jargon that you probably heard, for example, AI, trustworthy AI, generative AI, trust, responsibility, all these types of things. The problem is that we don't even have good definitions of what artificial intelligence is, because it's defined differently in different types of literature. So the way like I propose to approach it is just think about the types of algorithms that we have. And we have kind of autonomous and automatic algorithms. And when we talk about autonomous, usually people imagine terminators. That's the first thing that they imagine when we ask people, think about AI. 99% of people describe, Skynet and terminators. And of course, we are very far away from actually having terminators. The problem here is that, we're still in the process of developing the systems that are kind of self-aware, and I think we're very, very far away from doing that. So most of the time we're dealing with automatic systems. So automatic system is something like a coffee machine. It cannot determine its own purpose, and it cannot determine the pathway to that purpose. So if you have a coffee machine that says cappuccino, you press the button, it makes cappuccino, not latte or flat white or whatnot. And we have autotelonomic systems. So these are basically algorithms where you define what you want the algorithm to do, but then the algorithm has a little bit of freedom in going about the task. So for example, if you have an automated vacuum cleaner, well, I have one at home, and you tell this vacuum cleaner to clean the room, eventually it will figure out the most efficient way to going about the room and cleaning the room. And so, yeah, so I just want to say that we effectively operate in the kind of this upper right corner of this system where we have kind of purpose and decisions. And most of the time we deal with algorithms that cannot choose their purpose, but can make some decisions along the way. And there are many risks associated with those algorithms, of course. But, you know, we're very far from kind of having machines that are determining their own purpose and making decisions to kind of harm somebody. Having said that, I just want to say that there are many issues that we have in legal, ethical, and governance space. And these are issues kind of starting from the copyright problems. You probably all heard about generative AI and how it kind of takes things from artists or from writers without acknowledging them and generates something else, all the way to accountability. From legal perspective, we're still operating in this quadrant with view 4, where humans are 100% responsible. So legally, we do not have any responsibility attached to algorithms. So this is the current view, although we're kind of shifting towards some sort of hybrid understanding of responsibility, and that's incredibly interesting. Yeah, in terms of challenges in regulating AI, there are many. You know, we have basically a lot of heterogeneity in the way different countries approach regulations, and it has to do with cultural differences and differences in sort of legal systems. At the EU level, there are a lot of different initiatives. Obviously, we have high-level expert group. You probably heard about Bletchley Declaration by countries attending AI Safety Summit that just happened in the UK. And kind of many countries pledged their sort of commitment to make AI safe. And I think this is very important, and it's great to see that UK joined that. We also have all these discussions around AI Act. Is it happening? Is it not happening? And there are various issues with how risks are defined within that. So if you just look at this simple representation, you can see that chatbots are, for example, defined as limited risk. But I just gave you an example when someone had life-changing or life-threatening consequence as a result of talking to a chatbot. So, you know, it's very, very subjective area. Self-regulation. So I work with a lot of organizations who are trying to self-regulate, and there are both advantages and disadvantages of that. So we have interesting codes of conduct, and you might have one in your organization, or you might be thinking of having one. You might be thinking about certifications, or do we need certifications if we're using certain types of algorithms? I mean, this is all very interesting questions. Unfortunately, again, there is a lot of heterogeneity and not much resolutions here. Jointly with my colleagues, we wrote a very kind of influential paper on human rights that came out quite early in 2020 in the Oxford Handbook of AI Ethics, where we discussed the main principles of how you can incorporate human rights principles into design. And this is not just human rights by design, but it's essentially the understanding that ethical codes of conduct in the industry at the moment are normally coming from large corporations, and they're quite different. It just kind of depends on how a particular company describes or defines ethical and legal. But we need some sort of common ground here, and this will actually help us govern and regulate artificial intelligence and better understand what is ethical and what is trustworthy. So these are some sort of examples of initiatives, self-regulating initiatives that are, in my view, quite beneficial for companies. Like, for example, there is AI certification in Germany. There is Z inspections. There are different ways of trying to understand how AI systems could be better serving different communities. And, you know, there are many opportunities here. So you can have development of trustworthy systems that are better informed by heterogeneity of use, and third sector is great at that. You can also have, you also have to consider quite a lot of challenges here. I sort of am not going to dwell on them happy to go into that when we have Q&A session. But yeah, essentially the main problem is we don't have good definitions. So we have regulation that is constantly behind technology, and this is understandable because, you know, technology develops a lot faster than, you know, the regulatory systems move, and that's probably the way it is going to be for the foreseeable future, and we need to deal with that. And of course, we need to take into account different contexts in which artificial intelligence solutions operate. So yeah, in this work that I mentioned before, we sort of developed a set of principles that would help you to kind of incorporate human rights into the design. And these are basically design and deliberation, assessment, testing and evaluation, independent oversight, and traceability. Obviously, all of these things require resources, and it's very interesting, you know, angle to look at how third sector can implement these things, because there is shortage of resources, there is shortage of expertise, there is it's very difficult to find an independent oversight option for when you are exercising certain types of, or you're using certain types of algorithms in your work. So, what does third sector? What are the main things that third sector can do? Well, third sector can do a lot. So the first thing is that you know, we definitely need good standards for SMEs, small companies, and NGOs that have limited resources to address growing artificial intelligence risks. We need to have understanding of conceptual gaps, and we need to know how to fill them. We need to have this balance between codes of conduct and regulation. So if you have a code of conduct, it should be aligned with some regulatory perspectives. And it's important to meet and discuss these things like you do, which is great to see. I think the main value of third sector organizations is really giving the voice to underrepresented communities. I myself work a lot with First Nations Australians, so Aboriginal Australians, and these communities are completely you know, not represented in AI systems that we're developing today, because they're not working on the principles of human-centric or business-centric systems or artificial intelligence systems. They're working on, you know, on community principles. Everything is about community. Everything is about the country. And we're not developing technology at the moment that serve these communities well. But you, in your place, from your perspective, you are taking care about, you know, taking care of particular underrepresented community in your area. And it's very important to have this diverse voice included into the development of AI, design of AI conversations, so we can actually design systems that are listening to human rights, are listening to these underrepresented communities, because ultimately what we are after are inclusive and diverse artificial intelligence systems. I will leave you with this quote that I really like. It's again from a relatively old paper, but I really like it. That says that we should be focused on developing responsibility practices that work to minimize risk and clearly establish lines of accountability. So as long as you have that understanding in your organizations, you might not be at the forefront of developing inclusive artificial intelligence systems, but you definitely will be having good understanding of how to do it in your particular area. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ganna.
Sorry, you go, John.
It was a big part. I think we go straight to Tanya now, if that's all right. And while you've got Ganna's contribution fresh in your minds, feel free to pop questions in chat and we'll pick them up in a kind of combined Q&A in a moment. So Tanya, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. I don't have any slides, but I'm just going to talk hopefully for not too long so we can get stuck into some conversation. I'm aware that from my time at Amnesty, particularly, that these conversations, you know, balancing the outside world, external world, you know, analysis of the problem with internal practices and the fact that sometimes those things run against each other. At Amnesty, I'll start by just being super transparent. We had a dilemma, which was that we had a very, very strong position on big tech and on the business model of big tech, which we see as incompatible with human rights. And at the same time, our digital marketing teams and fundraising teams and others were using, and in fact, all across our communications, we were present in using the tools of big tech. And so how do you balance that? And I'm sure that that's something that's very much on everyone's mind in this call. I'm going to talk here about, for a few minutes, about our digital public sphere, because I think all of us, whether you're working on climate justice, racial justice, democracy, or indeed AI, ethics and regulation, we're all kind of in it together in facing this central challenge right now. And the challenge is that it's that our digital public sphere is rigged. It's rigged in ways that don't serve citizens, consumers, workers, society, democracy. It's rigged in a way that's actually stifling competition because of the market dominance of a handful of Silicon Valley corporations, which means it doesn't even serve our economies. And what do I mean by rigged? I'm referring really to the corporate power structure and incentives that underpin how all of us engage in the digital public sphere. What began as a seemingly harmless trade, and I only say harmless because I think most people saw it this way back then, the trade of our data for free services, essentially, has now spawned a handful of what I call data cartels that today fix the terms of access for the world's public square. And because of their monopoly on data, their market capitalization makes them the most lucrative companies on earth. These vast vaults of data that have been accumulated from what is, if we're being honest, is a corporate mass surveillance operation on the scale that not even the world's elite intelligence agencies like GCHQ or the NSA could have dreamed up if they tried. And it's been allowed to happen because what they were doing was largely kept invisible from people. And because we've all been, I think, convinced or kind of bought into a foundational lie. And the lie is this, that the only way that we can all have the products, services, and content that we like is to give up our data. And that lie shields from view the thousands of alternative ways that the internet could have evolved to bring people valuable products and services that were not oriented towards just maximizing attention for advertising revenue. If you think about it, the internet's really been here for the blink of an eye. If you think about it in the long telescopic lens of human evolution and even just the last few hundred years of technological advancement and progress, we are talking, just the lifespan of a company like Google and the lifespan of a company like Facebook is literally the blink of an eye. And yet we've all kind of believed that this version of the internet that we have now is the only one that can exist, and that it's in some way immutable. And this has kind of led people to accept a false choice even, which is, either leave the platforms or accept their terms rather than change their terms. So my work over the last 6 years or so has been focused on this: change the terms. What does it really take in terms of regulation to fundamentally rethink and overhaul the profit incentives and corporate power structures that have become crystallized as the internet that we now think is the only one we can have? Talking about the business model, which is obviously the word that gets used a lot when describing the profit incentives, what do I mean by that? There are two sides to the business model. One of them is the tracking ads, or I call surveillance advertising. Some people refer to, in fact, the companies love to refer to it as targeted advertising. I think this is a complete misnomer because there's lots of ways to target ads at people that do not actually require surveilling every single thing about them. So what we're talking about here is the kind of extraction of data to create really detailed, intrusive profiles about people in order to target them with ads. So surveillance advertising on the one side, that's the profit incentive. And on the other side of the business model is what I call addiction algorithms or predatory algorithms, which are the recommender systems that are increasingly the way that we content is curated for us, that use the same data profiling as used in the ad systems, plus a whole range of addictive design features that have been literally created just to keep people's eyeballs on screen, glued to screens as long as possible, to keep us infinitely scrolling, to keep us engaged, so that more ads can be served to us. And that, so the two things kind of are the two sides of the same coin. And why is this business model so bad from a human rights perspective? So I'll just lay out some facts here, because I think that they'll do a better job than I would have of, you know, the huge wide range of human rights problems that we see connected to this business model. Beginning with the surveillance advertising, I've heard Julia Andrin, a journalist in the US, calls this mass discrimination machine, and I think that's just quite apt. So there's too many examples to list, but in the US, investigators have found advertisers repeatedly using racist targeting characteristics to exclude non-white people from seeing housing ads. You know, the Trump campaign used the same system to try and deter Black voters from turning out in key districts to vote. Voter suppression campaigns through this system. Researchers here in the UK have found if you're a woman, you're not going to probably be as likely to be shown engineering ads, certain jobs that are just gendered, and that's baked into the way that we are recommended advertisements related to employment. This is an incredible fact. You know, a study presented to the British Parliament reported that by the time an average child in Europe is 13 years old, 13, the ad tech industry has 72 million data points on that child. The system by which almost 90% of online advertising is bought and sold, which is called the real-time bidding, or RTB, broadcasts data about European citizens all over the world 194 billion times every day. This data includes inferences about your religious faith, sexual preferences, medical conditions, wealth, and political views. I say inferences, it also includes data and facts. Just last week, an investigation by ICCL into a company called ISA, a private company that sells a surveillance tool called Patterns, which markets itself on its website as built literally on that data, on the RTB data source. So the 5 billion data points that come through RTB. And Patterns claims that it can provide a targeted person's current location, historical movements over several months, who they frequently met with. It can identify a target's children, co-workers, and their driving path, all from advertising data. I mean, this is, you know, when we say it's a privacy abuse, I think it's really important to put that into perspective. We're talking about a huge security threat. We're talking about you know, the national security implications to that. And Johnny Ryan has calls this the world's biggest data leak by design, because that's what this incentivizes in terms of that collection of data and that leaking of data. And then moving to recommender systems, a study by Facebook executives found that about 2/3, 64% of users on Facebook who joined extremist groups were directed there by Facebook's algorithm, by their own recommendations. The Integrity Institute developed a methodology to understand how much more amplification a disinformation post gets than a normal piece of content. And they used a methodology that took disinformation from the International Fact-Checking Network. And they found that on TikTok, disinformation gets 29 times the amplification. On Facebook, it gets 4 times the amplification. On Twitter, 35 times the amplification. And on YouTube, 6 times the amplification. The way that this business model is designed amplifies the worst type of content, which I think most of us understand from our experiences of being online, but there it is in a very clear, you know, and it's really interesting to check out their methodology if you're interested in how they did that. Recommended content includes all kinds of things. I mean, from hate speech and deeply, you know, stuff that is clearly illegal, but it also includes dangerously restrictive diets, pro-self-harm content romanticizing suicide to users, including if they're registered as under 16s. And this is becoming a very big issue for children and young people. And the tragic case that we had here in the UK of the death of Molly Russell, the coroner who inquired into her case ruled that she did not die by suicide, but by an act of self-harm whilst under the influence of harmful social media. The algorithm fed her 16,000 pieces of content promoting suicide to a 14-year-old child, in the just handful of weeks before her death, before she took her life. Research from Amnesty International just 2 weeks ago has showed this rabbit hole effect. They had they created a set of sock puppet accounts of mimicking 13-year-olds, and then they watched what happens if they interact with one piece of content that has mental health related to it. What happens? Where does the TikTok algorithm take you? Between 3 and 20 minutes into the research, more than half of the videos in the For You feed were related to mental health struggles, with multiple recommended videos in a single hour romanticizing, normalizing, or encouraging suicide. Just let that sink in for a minute. This is the system that has been unleashed on our children, all alongside incredibly addictive design features that keep them coming back and make them essentially hooked to their phones, which, again, anyone with a child knows is becoming a public health crisis. In terms of, we don't have children smoking cigarettes, but we give them these devices which are designed in every way to, send dopamine hits to their brain that keep them coming back and falling down these rabbit holes, be that a rabbit hole of the pro-suicide content, be that a rabbit hole of increasingly, conspiracy theories and disinformation, or be that a rabbit hole of body image and, restrictive diet pills for teenage girls. So what does all of this mean? I have concluded, after working on these issues for many, many years, that the only way that this cannot be dealt with at the level of minor changes by platforms, that we need a fundamental overhaul of the way that big tech platforms operate and generate revenue to no longer be driven by predatory surveillance advertising and addiction algorithms. That means a ban on surveillance advertising, and that means outlawing and fundamentally remaking the mechanics that create content recommendations. This is not a question of ethics at all, but a question of law, and it's a question of profit and power. Just as we cannot expect fossil fuel companies to take ethical choices to phase out fossil fuels, we cannot expect the answers to come from the platforms themselves here. They are the source of the problem. Solutions will not lie with them. They will lie with law, hard law. And on this front, regulators are moving. So we've had, Ross mentioned at the start, the Digital Services Act, which I've been working on for a couple of years, which is just coming into force now, which is the first watershed rules on big tech platforms, where there's things like audit powers, where companies are going to have to assess the risks of their platforms and then mitigate those risks by changing the design of and features of the platforms. We actually managed to get a ban on the use of sensitive data for targeted advertising. Unfortunately, that doesn't include inferences that could be sensitive, and so it doesn't, you can't use someone's race to target them, but you could use all kinds of proxies for race. And this is why we think until you ban surveillance advertising altogether, you don't solve the problem. You don't solve the incentive that creates that incredible deep data free-for-all, which in some ways is just the original sin of the internet. So the regulators are moving, and I think we have to, nonprofits and third sector need to get their head around is like, what you've had until now and what we've all got very used to is not going to be the future. And so it's really important not to stick heads in sand and really, see where the tides are going and be kind of ahead of the curve on that. No one in the third sector wants to be the ones that are only changing when regulators literally come along and force them to. I think we should be setting the trend on this. I think it's really important to invest in alternatives and to understand that there are alternatives. So contextual advertising, declared interests. It's perfectly possible to actually be asking people what kind of advertising they would like to see at a much less intrusive and much higher level. So that some form of targeted advertising and finding the people you want to connect with as a company or as an NGO can still happen. And that's very possible. There's actually examples of companies that have done this already, and the New York Times changed away from tracking people and found that its revenues went up when it only used contextual advertising, which contextual advertising means they're not tracking you based on anything you've done in the past, they're just sharing an ad based on what you're looking at. So we have a whole bunch of ways to organize advertising online that are not based on surveillance. We've also got ethical companies like Lush, who have just stopped using social media for marketing. So I think that also should sink in for us in the third sector, that companies like Lush, whose entire revenue depends on reaching on marketing in lots of ways, they are taking big ethical decisions like that. And so again, let's not be late. And then finally, just be part of the solution. I think, join the movement for change and the calls for regulation. Like I said, from my experience from Amnesty, don't let the fact that you feel implicated by still using and relying on these tools stop you from taking a really strong public stance on the fact that the tools need changing. And I think if there is some parallel here with climate, in that people need to be able to fly to COP, and in order to try and come up with really big global agreements on climate, some people who work on climate change are going to use aeroplanes to fly to COP. Increasingly less and less, thankfully, but they can do that, and whilst still saying you need to fundamentally reform the aviation industry, and we need to phase out fossil fuels. And I think in a similar way, we need to be very clear on not compromising, identifying the problem, calling for the solutions, even if we are aware that, well, these tools, well, they are the only tools, while the public square is inside the four walls of Google and Facebook and these other companies, we are going to be still present there. And that's an uncomfortable place to be, but we can be transparent about it. If you're interested, Amnesty, we wrote a blog at the time about how the fact that we were still staying in these spaces, even as we fundamentally believe they're incompatible with human rights and want to see a wholesale reform of the business model underpinning them. And I will stop there because I definitely want to make sure we have some time to chat.
Thank you so much, Tanya. That was really good. And that, I guess that finishing point for me has always been a dilemma that's come up time and time again, that notion of, well, we can't have these discussions while we're still using Google or Microsoft products, or we're still talking to people on Facebook and Instagram and on Twitter/X. So I think that for me is a really nice way of actually framing some of these discussions, where it doesn't need to be defeatist, that we don't need to immediately move to spaces where people are not, simply because they're not Google and Facebook. So John, anything, or Beth, anything that's kind of jumping out you want to kind of pick up as a first question, and then we'll kind of move to the room?
So I guess something I was thinking about was, that was probably about 3 DigiShifts worth. There's loads. I mean, this, for all the discussions we've had, it's so many really important questions. So I'm really grateful to our speakers for bringing those. What I was trying to think about was a bit of a way to kind of step through some of the questions. So one thing I was thinking about was, it's likely that with AI, people aren't doing much yet, but they're starting to wonder about how they might do. And that point that Ganna was making about the role of the voluntary sector in bringing a voice and a perspective. Whereas I think with Tanya's contribution, we're probably already putting quite a lot into that not so private digital sphere that's so problematic. So maybe questions I'd be wondering about would be, to the room, are any organizations starting to think about what kind of principles they might use, and what their thoughts are on that? Is it rights-based? Is it something else? And then a piece about a question to Ganna might be, I know you're advocating it, we do need a rights-based approach. Global standards are really important. Are you feeling hopeful we'll get there, or is it going to be very tricky to keep up with the technological developments? Maybe that as a kind of starting point, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think that it's important to move towards global regulation. And definitely the Declaration of Human Rights provides us with some sort of pathways to do it, because almost all countries of the world, not all, but as we know, but the majority agreed on the declaration, and that's great. But I think it's kind of more important to think about the practicalities of how do you apply, this international standards or national standards to your domain in your organization, because it's nice to have principles, but then when we talk about securing our customers, securing people that we are working with in third sector, it's more important to understand how do you actually apply all these fantastic principles. Will we reach an agreement? I'm sure that there will be some large, international communities that will join this initiative. So there will always be countries that will not. But at the same time, it's good that we're looking into these issues. So Tanya mentioned quite a lot of interesting aspects. I just want to add to that first of all, the point about data. I just want you to all to understand that Google and other organizations that are keeping that are the key holders to these large data sets, they do not have better quality data sets. They are selling perceptions, and as a behavioral scientist, I can tell you that that's a very powerful sale, because they kind of convinced everyone that they have better data sets that you can collect from the public domain. They don't. You can collect data from the public domain that will be just as powerful, and combining data sets from the public domain will also have some very serious implications on somebody's privacy. Because, for example, if I come to John and says, so John, can I ask you for your purchasing data so I can better predict what you're gonna like tomorrow? He probably, and I will tell him I will use it for a research project. John will probably say, oh yeah, sure, Ganna, you can have it. But then if I take that data and combine it with a bunch of other things that I learned about John, now all of a sudden I know something about him that he doesn't want me to know. And that's the problem. The problem is that we don't know where the data sets are. There is no ledger that tells us, what's going on. There is also a whole issue around exploitation or data exploitation, because the data sets that are used are normally collected from kind of rural populations in third world countries, and then the benefits of the technologies are actually implemented in large cities. So my institute obviously is very vocal about these types of things, but I just want to say that there's also uneven sort of distribution, for example, between people on Android phones who provide like the majority of data that we train systems on, and people on iPhones who actually enjoy the benefits of using the algorithms that are trained on that data. So yeah, so I think it would be good to get to a point where all countries agree, but I think UK just needs to walk to the pace of the fastest, not the slowest in that conversation.
Great, thank you very much.
Can I ask a question?
Go for it, Ganna. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, obviously, like if you're here, you're interested in this topic. Can you tell us kind of what practical issues you face? Maybe someone can share, a practical problem that they've been working on and thinking about.
Okay, as if by magic, Pauline's popped a nice practical question in chat. So about, do we need to apply any caution when working with any advertising? So, a very practical question there in a cookie banner, might you have a policy which is more restrictive so that you're not doing the surveillance work automatically? Maybe Tanya, would that be one you might want to jump in on, because it's
really good question.
Yeah.
It's exactly the right question. So I don't think that the incentive is not there for big tech to stop predatory surveillance advertising. We know that. I literally had the fight with them for 2 years in trying to push for this in the European Digital Services Act. There will be a follow-up to this now in the next European Commission, where there's a new legislation coming. So the fight is going to happen all over again. I think there's a large number of MEPs who are on our side. They're called the Tracking Free Ads Coalition. So there is a genuine increasing momentum to push. In fact, Norway already banned, they did a pause for several months where you can no longer use, like for example, Facebook cannot use targeted advertising in Norway. So there is some big regulatory experiments happening on this. We need to be pushing them to contextual advertising and other models. We need to be calling out the, frankly, BS that they cannot support their service without this type of invasive, and as Ganna just pointed out, not just invasive, but it's also a lot of smoke and mirrors. So it's probably not even really, I've heard this come from a lot of advertisers, probably not even really working in the way that advertisers think it is, but they're all hooked on certain KPIs now, thanks to Facebook and Google. So I think being part of that movement, pushing for that and thinking and preparing for the fact that you will not have the same targeting reach in the future that you do now. So you already should be thinking about experimentation outside of, how can you be reaching people using, for example, maybe higher level categories, less intrusive ones. I mean, I think things like location are fairly uncontroversial. It gets very different once you're starting to profile people based on interests. When people accept cookies, I mean, cookie banners are probably going to disappear within the next few years. They are illegal, really, under GDPR. I mean, GDPR has kind of created a whole set of what are called dark patterns, as people are just trying to trick people into consent. Really, what the law actually says is you should give people a choice, and that choice should probably be offered one time rather than on every single website. So I think what we will see is this will, as the guidance comes down from legislation and as some important court cases play out, it will change again. So I think if you're trying to be ahead of the curve and be ethical, you should really just be asking people, you know, in a very straightforward way, would you like, you know, like, so a good example is there's an NPO, and I can share this after the call if you'd like, but a Dutch broadcaster who decided to actually comply with GDPR found that it offered people, do you want us to track you? And that people said no. I think like 90% of people, when actually offered properly, say no. So their revenue plummeted off a cliff. And then they got smart and got clever and started experimenting. And within 1 year, they had built back their revenue and increased it. And within a couple of years, they had doubled it. So they got smart about contextual advertising and other ways to keep people coming to their site and engaging with them that didn't involve tracking them. So there are case studies. I'd suggest learning, getting, you know, figuring out what others have done and following suit.
Brilliant. Should we take a question from Gillian next? You had your hand up. Go for it, Gillian.
Thanks, John. It was just a kind of response to Ganna's question about what are the things that I'm thinking about. So I work for an organisation that's an umbrella body for UK fire and rescue services. So we provide guidance and frameworks for doing things. The fire and rescue service is probably quite immature in its use of digital data technology, more so than you might think. The kind of position I'm in at the moment is that there's quite a will to start using things like AI and look at the benefits that it can bring. But the fire service is fundamentally about harm prevention, and I think that should include the way that we use these digital tools and services, as well as, you know, putting out fires and stopping fires from happening. So we're at the very start of the journey about thinking about how we might put a framework around. So if you think about it, we're the kind of carrot, if you like, and the inspectorate is the stick. So we can't mandate action, but we want to share and show good practice. And how do we do that in such a way to make it attractive to the services who have their own teams and varying levels of resources to do it in the best way?
Thank you, Gillian. That was a really good way of like underlining that dilemma. Is loads of charities think as part of our mission we have this need to reach people and increase our audience size, but it's like ethical ways of doing that. If I may, one like practical thought I wanted to throw into the mix was about privacy policies. I once worked in an organization where a colleague was very concerned about surveillance and inappropriate use of data. So what we did was we really looked at our privacy policy from the ground up and tried to write in very clear language. And that basically made us make some choices about not using certain bits of technology, but also explaining it very clearly and not getting into the kind of the legal hand waving that you sometimes do in a privacy policy, but making sure as a document this was clear and accessible to everyone. And that was quite a helpful practice because it meant that we could be confident it really connected with our values in the organization and wasn't just a sort of cut and paste from this is what we usually expect to see in a privacy policy. So it's a small but boring detail. I'm sure nobody's sitting there saying I'm going to run away and rewrite my privacy policy, but it was a good like pragmatic step to take. Did you want to go, Ganna?
Yes, I think this is a really cool question because I work a lot as a behavioral scientist. I'm normally brought in and asked, well, how do we make cybersecurity more exciting? Or how do we kind of involve people who don't care at all into this kind of privacy sort of debate? You know, this is actually, I mean, one thing that I can tell you that always works. If you explain to people how AI touches their specific job, or so technology touches their job or their KPIs, or how can they can make their sort of how can help them in their functions, they will listen. And normally, you know, the assumption is that people don't care or they will not engage. We actually conducted so one of the researchers that is based in Scotland by the name of Karen Renault. She's really cool. She's in Strathclyde University. She does a lot of work on cybersecurity. And the usual assumption is that people don't care, you know, they will not engage. But then she conducted this experiment where she put a typewriter in the hallway of an organization and asked people to type their thoughts about cybersecurity. And it turned out that a lot of people had very strong thoughts, like very strong opinions, even though they were not, engaged with the corporate training on this. So that just means that corporate training is done in a completely ridiculous way. I can tell you that, so my son is 7 years old. We have developed at home a kind of a storybook around cybersecurity. And we kind of show him this storybook. It's about a girl who kind of shared her data passwords and things like that, and then basically completely lost control of her life. So this is a story we made up. And that keeps him engaged. He understands that he shouldn't share his passwords. He shouldn't do this, that, and that. So I'm pretty sure that he's kind of less mature than, firefighters, or you have to deal with. So, but basically, yeah, I think if you clearly explain to people how that benefits them, so how it makes their job easier. I'm happy to think about this if you want, Gillian, kind of offline, maybe help you with this question in the specific context. But yeah, I mean, normally people would engage if they see the value. And about surveillance, John, your point, can you hide from it? Like Tanya said, it's very difficult. I can tell you that my team had a project where we had data from a retailer. And it was like a drugstore retailer. And basically, with 3 months worth of data, we could predict whether someone would get pregnant next year. Well, that's a very invasive piece of information, potentially. It can help you sell a lot of stuff to this person or to this couple, right? But it also kind of it also lies with the people who are using it, right? So how you use it. So because we are researchers, obviously, we didn't use this opportunity, this information. We are bound by the laws of ethics, and we have external oversight. We have to, do ethics declarations. We have to collect informal consent from people. So all of this is very important. I think how you can, there is no way to protect yourself against it, but if you know what you are using and what you are sharing, that is a great thing to understand. Because what we found in our research is that very few people understand how their data is shared by applications on the phone, for example. Just take the time, take a day of your life and look into the terms and conditions of everything that you are using. And you will be surprised that, certain applications have permissions to go into your calendar and change stuff. And most people just don't take the time. And that is something that someone should know, so that everyone should know, it just helps you to better understand.
Time, Ganna, and we might need to finish up.
Yeah. I'm going to shut up.
No, don't be that. We've got about 2 minutes left, and I was kind of hoping we could bring in Tanya just at the final point there as well. Just, if there's anything else you want to come in on that, or any kind of final words of wisdom or thoughts or kind of next steps for the people in the room?
No, I think the only point I have is sort of a bit of a rally cry, really. I think we are just like with the climate crisis, it suddenly coming into focus. For a long time it was, should I turn off my light switch, should I stop flying? And then suddenly there was a moment where we had people like teenagers going, the world's on fire. What's the future of what world are you leaving for us? And I think in a similar way, I really feel that every social and progressive issue that we care about in this room, every single thing that we work on is affected by having a digital public sphere and an information sphere that has been rigged in the way that it has, and the power that is in a handful of just a couple of global corporations, their market dominance, the complete lack of real regulation that and I think now is a time where we just need everybody's voices. So it might not be your issue, but I think seeing how your organization can be you know, making these arguments and, you know, yes, look at the internal processes and look at those things, but also join the fight, really, you know. And People versus Big Tech, which I run, is 120 organizations in Europe. We've got a partnership with Lush that we're launching in a couple of days, the Big Tech Rebellion, like they're quitting all their social media channels that they've been doing. There's a bath bomb you can buy that's, you know, proceeds of which, you know, like we're trying to take this fight now into the streets and into, with a new film into schools, into working with children and young people, building a youth movement. So there's loads happening. Now is the time. And I'd just love to connect with people that are, you know, please feel free to join our mailing list and just be connected to this fight.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much to Ganna and Tanya. I mean, you can look at the comments that are in there, but that's for me one of the most interesting DigiShift sessions that we've had so far. And I think it's kind of probably provoked a lot of people in the room, particularly there's people in this room work for quite big third sector organizations. There's people in this room work for funders. There's people in this room working at the kind of the edge of what digital means for the charity sector at the moment. And I know wrestling with some of these conversations. So I'm sure these chats will kind of go beyond this room with Tanya and Ganna as well. John, any final thoughts from you before we wrap up?
I suppose we've gone very quickly. I was thinking of the self-driving car example, and that for me is a very good practical example of the problem with engineering and digital is people go, well, we could make this, so we might give it a go and see what happens. And the problem, I think, for the voluntary sector is we're working in high-stakes circumstances with vulnerable people. We need to be a lot more careful. So it's about that kind of bringing that critical judgment and bringing the voices in to make sure we can keep things that aren't harmful. Yeah, that's my waffly wrap up, I guess. But thank you so much, everyone, for their thoughts and perspectives. Cool. Thanks very much.
A reminder to you to switch off the recording, John.
Oh, thank you.